They say the truth is a bright light, but for me, it felt like a serrated blade through the heart. I remember standing in the center of the grand ballroom at the Peninsula Hotel in Chicago, surrounded by the scent of fresh pine needles and expensive perfume. Outside, a winter storm howled against the glass, coating the city in a deceptive layer of pristine white ice. Inside, everything was gold. The chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, casting a warm glow over 500 guests who laughed and toasted to a love they believed was eternal. Today was my brother Lucas's wedding day, and as I watched him stand at the altar in his charcoal tuxedo, looking every bit the protector he had been to me since our parents died, my heart swelled with a pride so intense it felt like a physical weight. Beside me stood Marcus, my husband of 5 years. He was an architect of tall buildings and, I believed, the architect of my happiness. He squeezed my hand, his thumb tracing the gold band on my finger, and whispered that I looked more beautiful than the bride. I believed him. I believed in the perfection of my marriage. I believed that my life was a sanctuary built on a foundation of ironclad trust. The ceremony was a symphony of silk and promises. Isabella, my future sister-in-law, was a vision in delicate lace, her eyes shimmering with what I thought was virginal devotion. When the reception began, the air turned electric with celebration. But an hour into the festivities, I realized Marcus had slipped away. I wanted a photograph of the four of us, the new pillars of the family, so I set off to find him. I wandered away from the thrumming bass of the orchestra, moving toward the quiet, shadowed corridors of the hotel's east wing. The further I walked, the more the music faded into a ghostly echo. I reached a secluded hallway that led to a small, ornamental balcony overlooking the frozen lake. The air there was thin and cold. I saw a sliver of light spilling through a partially closed glass door. I stopped. My breath hitched in my throat as I saw a flash of white lace against a dark tuxedo. I moved closer, my footsteps silenced by the thick carpet, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. Through the narrow gap in the door, the world as I knew it ceased to exist. My husband was not alone. He held Isabella, my brother's bride, gripped tightly in his arms. Her white wedding dress was bunched in his hands, and they were kissing with a visceral, predatory hunger that made my stomach churn. It was not just an affair. It was a desecration. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold numbness spreading from my fingertips to my chest until I felt like a statue of ice ready to shatter. I wanted to scream, to throw open the door and demand an explanation for this ultimate betrayal, but then they started to speak. Their voices were low, sharp, and filled with a casual cruelty that paralyzed me. Isabella giggled. A sound that was no longer sweet, but shrill and mocking. She asked him if he was afraid of being caught on her wedding night. Marcus let out a short, jagged laugh, a sound I had never heard in 5 years of marriage. He told her that no one would ever suspect. He called my brother a lovesick fool and an easy target. Then, his voice dropped an octave, turning cold and clinical. He said that my marriage to him was nothing more than a strategic move, a way to gain the status of being married into a well-respected family. He called me a shield, a social ornament, and a breeding machine whose only purpose was to provide him an heir before he found a way to discard me. My ears rang with the force of his words. He promised Isabella that once they successfully funneled the assets from my brother's company and bankrupted Lucas, they would disappear together with the fortune. They were planning to destroy my brother's legacy, the company our parents had built from nothing, while I stood by as a blind, adoring puppet. I backed away, my vision blurring. Every step felt like walking through deep water. I stumbled back into the main hallway, the distant laughter of the wedding guests sounding like a taunt. I felt a profound sense of nausea, a visceral rejection of the air I was breathing. I turned a corner and collided with a solid chest. I looked up through a veil of hot, silent tears and saw Lucas. He was standing there with a glass of champagne, his face illuminated by a wall sconce. I expected to see the joy of a groom, but his eyes were like 2 pieces of flint. I threw myself into his arms, my body shaking with suppressed sobs. I whispered the truth into his ear, the words coming out in jagged, broken pieces. I told him about the kiss, the plan to bankrupt the company, the breeding machine comment, and the cold-blooded affair happening just 30 feet away. I waited for the explosion. I waited for him to roar in anger, to storm down that hallway and tear Marcus apart with his bare hands. But Lucas did not move. He did not flinch. His grip on my shoulders was steady, his hands large and warm against my shivering frame. He looked down at me with an expression of terrifying, absolute calm. There was no surprise in his gaze, only a deep, unsettling resolve that made my skin crawl. He reached up, gently wiping a stray tear from my cheek with his thumb. He leaned in close, his voice a low, melodic hum that carried the weight of a death sentence. He told me not to worry. He told me that I had done exactly what I was supposed to do. Then, he leaned in further and whispered a sentence that chilled me to my very marrow. He said that the main event had not even started yet. As he led me back toward the ballroom, I realized that I was no longer just a victim of a cheating husband. I was a witness to a much larger, much darker war, and my brother was the general. The celebration was over, and the execution was about to begin. Lucas pulled me into the sterile silence of the groom's suite, locking the door against the festive noise of the ballroom. His hands were steady, but his eyes were cold enough to burn. He didn't offer me comfort. He offered me the truth. He told me he had been watching them for 3 months. While I was dreaming of anniversaries, he was receiving weekly reports from private investigators. He had seen the subtle glances, the abnormal familiarity, and the greed dripping off Isabella like cheap perfume. He wasn't just a jilted groom. He was a hunter waiting for his prey to assemble. He explained that Marcus was not just a cheating husband, but a mercenary hired by Arthur Vaughan, the old fox who had been trying to dismantle our father's company for 2 decades. My marriage was the key they used to unlock the front door of our lives. I felt a hollow ache in my chest as the broken trust of 5 years solidified into a cold, hard resolve. Lucas told me to play the part of the grieving wife just a little longer. He whispered that the higher they climbed, the more bones they would break when they fell. We returned to the hall, and the air felt different, charged with the static of an impending storm. I sat in the front row, Marcus's arm draped over my shoulder like a heavy, suffocating noose. He whispered sweet, lying promises into my ear as the master of ceremonies began the ring exchange. But as Marcus reached for the gold band, the double doors at the back of the hall swung open with a violent thud. A woman dressed in elegant charcoal silk marched down the aisle, her face a mask of righteous fury. She was the mother of Isabella's former fiancé, a man Isabella had abandoned and robbed just 4 months ago. She threw a stack of engagement photos onto the white rose petals, screaming that the bride was a parasitic fraud. Isabella stood on the stage, her face draining of all color, looking like a ghost in her own wedding dress. That was just the first strike. Lucas walked slowly toward the technical booth and gave a sharp nod. The 2 giant LED screens that had been displaying romantic montages suddenly flickered and died. When they ignited again, the ballroom gasped in unison. The footage was high definition and unforgiving. It showed the balcony from 20 minutes ago. It showed my husband, Marcus, crushing Isabella against the railing. The audio was crystal clear, echoing through the silent, horrified room. I heard Marcus call me a breeding machine. I heard them laugh about bankrupting my brother and turning our family into puppets. The betrayal was no longer a private pain. It was a public execution. The elite of Chicago watched as Marcus and Isabella were stripped bare in their own filth. Lucas turned his gaze toward the VIP section, fixing his eyes on Arthur Vaughan. He announced to the crowd that Vaughan was the mastermind, the one who had funded Isabella's facade and promised Marcus a throne built on our ruins. The silence that followed was broken by a piercing scream. Isabella, her sanity snapping under the weight of the exposure, ripped a long, silver hairpin from her hair and lunged at me with the desperation of a cornered animal. Before I could flinch, Marcus threw himself in front of me, the sharp metal piercing his shoulder. Blood blossomed across his white shirt, a stark crimson stain on his lies. He looked at me with a gaze that begged for forgiveness, but I felt nothing but an immense, cooling emptiness. Whether his move was a final act of sincere guilt or one last play for my sympathy, it didn't matter. My marriage was a carcass, and I was done being the mourner. I walked past him without a word, leaving the chaos behind. As I stepped out into the freezing Chicago night, The weight of the last 5 years stayed in that room. The girl who entered that hotel was gone, and the woman who left was finally, terrifyingly free. The jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada mountains were my only companions for months, as I sought sanctuary in the isolation of Lake Tahoe. I moved there to bury the remains of a life that had turned into a cemetery of shattered illusions. The divorce was finally over, the legal documents sitting on my kitchen counter like the cold, black cinders of a burnt house. Every signature I had penned was a final, agonizing nail in the coffin of a relationship that had been nothing more than a masterfully crafted performance by the man I once called my husband. I had spent 5 years pouring my devotion into a vessel of broken trust, only to realize that Marcus had never loved me. He had only loved the access my name provided. I spent my days walking the shoreline, the emerald water of the lake lapping at my feet, trying to convince myself that I was whole again. During this time of fragile reconstruction, Nathan drifted into my life. He was a local officer with eyes the color of the deep water and a quiet strength that didn't demand anything from me. He was the opposite of Marcus. Where Marcus was all polished marble and sharp edges, Nathan was solid granite and warmth. He didn't ask me to explain the shadows in my eyes. He just stood beside me while I gathered the jagged shards of my soul, offering a sense of security I had long forgotten existed. For the first time in a long time, the weight in my chest began to lift. But peace is often a deceptive veil. On the afternoon of my daughter Ava's second birthday, the quiet was shattered by the arrival of a small, unassuming package. Inside, nestled on a bed of midnight blue velvet, was a white gold bracelet shaped like a blooming lotus, encrusted with diamonds that shimmered with a predatory light. It was a piece of breathtaking craftsmanship, an heirloom that Nathan estimated to be worth at least $30,000. My heart plummeted when I pulled the small, elegant card from the silk ribbon. It read in a refined, flowing script, "Happy birthday to my beautiful little princess, from Grandma." A cold, visceral dread washed over me. My mother, Catherine, had been dead and buried for over a decade. Marcus's mother was a bitter woman who had vanished into the cracks of the scandal and possessed neither the grace nor the $30,000 to send such a gift. The mystery gnawed at my bones, a relentless itch that Nathan saw and understood. He insisted on driving me back to my childhood home in the suburbs, a place I hadn't visited since my brother's disastrous wedding. The house stood like a silent tombstone under the gray Chicago sky. I climbed the rickety ladder into the attic, the air thick with the suffocating scent of cedar, dust, and old paper. I pushed aside trunks of winter clothes until I found a small wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a frayed purple ribbon. They were addressed to my mother, Catherine, but they were not from my father. They were from a woman named Adrienne. As I unfolded the brittle, yellowed pages, the foundation of my life collapsed. The letters spoke of a horrific car crash 25 years ago in the Rocky Mountains. They spoke of a debt of life and a secret so dangerous it had to be buried in a nameless grave. At the bottom of the box, I found the adoption decrees. Lucas and I were not the biological children of Catherine and her husband. We were the survivors of an execution attempt. Our biological mother was Adrienne Revas, the legendary queen of a jewelry empire, who was supposed to have perished in a ball of fire 25 years ago. The letters proved that she had survived, scarred and hunted, and had given us to Catherine to keep us out of the reach of the monster who had cut her brake lines. The woman who sent that bracelet was a ghost who had finally stepped out of the shadows. I was not who I thought I was, and the mother I had mourned for 25 years was still breathing, somewhere in the dark, waiting for us to finish what had started on that mountain road. The weight of the letters from the attic felt like lead in my hands as Lucas and I sat in the dim light of his study, connecting the jagged pieces of a nightmare. The truth was a serrated blade that cut through 25 years of lies. Arthur Vaughan was not just a corporate predator, he was a murderer. He was the one who had orchestrated the sabotage of our biological parents' car on that isolated mountain pass, all to swallow the Revas jewelry empire whole. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. The betrayal I had suffered from Marcus during my marriage was nothing more than a faint, pathetic echo of the ancient cruelty Vaughn had inflicted upon my bloodline. My husband had been a pawn, but Vaughn was the king of a kingdom built on corpses. We were no longer just looking for a way to save a company. We were hunting for the justice that had been denied to our mother for 2.5 decades. Nathan stood beside me on the rooftop of the Miller Tower, his silhouette sharp against the charcoal sky of Chicago. He was a man of the law, but tonight, he was the only shield I had against the darkness. Apex Heights loomed across the street, a monolith of glass and steel that served as Vaughn's fortress. At 2 a.m, the city was a vast, indifferent ocean of flickering lights, 800 feet below our feet. The wind screamed through the narrow canyons between the skyscrapers, a cold and hungry beast that tugged at my clothes as Nathan secured the high tensile cable. My breath came in shallow, freezing gasps. I looked at the thin line stretching into the abyss and felt a primal, suffocating fear. But then I thought of Adrienne, hunted and scarred, and Catherine, who had carried our secret to her grave. I thought of the broken trust that had defined my life, and the fear turned into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. I stepped off the ledge. The world vanished into a blur of gray steel and black sky. There was only the vibrating hum of the cable and the terrifying roar of the gale. I clutched the harness with knuckles so white they looked like bone. Every inch I moved was a battle against the vertigo that threatened to pull me into the deep. My heart was a frantic hammer against my ribs, each strike echoing the name of the man who had stolen my parents from me. Nathan watched me with eyes full of a quiet, desperate strength, his hands ready to catch me if the world decided to end. When my boots finally struck the narrow glass ledge of Apex Heights, the impact sent a jolt of electricity through my spine. I was inside the lion's den. We moved through the executive suite like ghosts, our flashlights cutting small, shivering holes in the oppressive darkness. Vaughn's office smelled of expensive tobacco and the stale air of a man who believed he was untouchable. We searched with a desperate efficiency until Nathan found it behind a hidden panel of carved mahogany. An old cassette recorder sat there, covered in a thin veil of dust but perfectly intact. I pressed play, and the voice of a younger Arthur Vaughn filled the room. It was a cold, clinical sound, devoid of a single shred of human empathy. He was giving the order to finish the Rivas family. He spoke of accidents, failed brakes, and unrecognizable bodies as if he were discussing a ledger of expenses. Beneath the machine lay a black leather diary, its pages filled with the encrypted codes and coordinates for a private vault in a Swiss bank. It was the ultimate evidence. As we slipped back into the night, the weight of the diary against my chest felt like the first beat of a new heart. The old fox was cornered, and the light of justice was finally beginning to dawn. The air inside the Gold Coast ballroom was suffocating, thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the hollow laughter of people who worshipped at the altar of power. Arthur Vaughn stood at the center of it all, a king on a throne of glass, raising a crystal flute to toast another year of his dominance. He looked invincible, but I knew the foundations of his empire were already screaming under the weight of the truth we had carried back from Switzerland. Lucas and I walked through the towering oak doors together, not as victims, but as the reckoning he never saw coming. Nathan followed close behind with a team of officers, their footsteps a rhythmic drumbeat of impending justice. When the music stopped and the room fell into a jagged silence, I stepped forward and cast the Swiss documents onto the velvet tablecloth. These papers were the ghosts of 25 years of systemic murder and calculated fraud. I watched as the color drained from Vaughn's face, his skin turning the gray of wet ash as he realized the black leather diary and the recordings had finally found their way home. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists with a cold, metallic finality that echoed through the hall. As they hauled him away, he looked like nothing more than a small, broken old man stripped of his stolen glory. Weeks later, in the quiet of my home, I received a final letter from France. The envelope was thin, smelling faintly of lavender and the salty air of the Mediterranean. It was the last testament of Adrienne Rivas. Her handwriting was a fragile, trembling line that spoke of a quarter century of silent agony. She explained that her sacrifice, her decision to remain a dead woman in the eyes of the world, was the only way to ensure the monster stayed away from our beds. She had watched us from afar, a shadow mother who lived in a state of perpetual exile so that we could have a name that did not mark us for death. She wrote that seeing Vaughn fall had finally given her permission to let go. She passed away 3 days after the trial ended, finally at peace, reuniting with our father in a place where the breaks never fail and the light never fades. I held that paper to my chest and cried for the mother I had lost twice. But this time, the tears were not bitter. They were a baptism. A year after the storm had passed, I stood on the sapphire shores of Lake Tahoe. The mountains were capped with white, and the air was so crisp it felt like breathing diamonds. I wore a simple dress, the fabric fluttering in the alpine breeze as I looked into Nathan's eyes. There were no hidden cameras here, no cold calculations, and no corporate agendas. This was not the hollow performance of my first marriage. I remembered the day I signed my divorce papers, thinking that every relationship was a trap designed to bleed me dry. I had once believed that my husband was my world, only to discover he was a parasite in a designer suit. But as Nathan took my hand and promised to be my sanctuary, I realized that the most brutal betrayal of my life had been the very thing that led me to my true family. I had moved beyond the wreckage of a tragic Reddit relationship story and into a horizon built on the bedrock of truth. The lotus on my wrist caught the afternoon sun, a symbol of a life that had grown from the mud of a dark past into the light of a beautiful, unshakable future. Lucas stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder, a testament to the blood that had survived the fire. I was no longer a shield or a breeding machine. I was Elena Revas, and I was finally home.